Now, when I was a boy in school, I'll go back to this because my experience may not be, I don't know how typical it would be of children brought up in the United States in a religious environment. But my experience in England was quite fascinating. About, you know, when one is baptized as a child, and you don't know anything about it, and your godfathers and godmothers are your sponsors. Then there comes a time when you are about to enter into puberty, when you are confirmed, when you undertake for yourself your own baptismal vows that were made on behalf of you. And in England, confirmation into the Church of England, which is Episcopalian in this country, confirmation is preceded by instruction. And this instruction consisted very largely of lessons in church history, because the British approach to religion is peculiarly archaeological. It is based on the great past, the great Christian saints and heroes. And it's really quite interesting, because it somehow associates you, puts you in the tradition of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and all that sort of thing. But the time comes when every candidate for confirmation has a private talk with the school chaplain. And obviously, in every process of initiation into mysteries, from time immemorial, there has been the passing on of a secret. And so there's a certain anticipation about this very private communication, because you would think if you were being initiated into a religion, what the secret consists of is some marvelous information about the nature of God, or the fundamental reason for being, and so on. But not so in this case. The initiatory secret talk was a serious lecture on the evils of masturbation. What these evils were not clearly specified. And so, but it was vaguely hinted that ghastly diseases would result. And so we used to, in a perverse way, enjoy tormenting ourselves with imaginations as to what kind of terrible venereal diseases, epilepsy, tuberculosis, and the great Siberian itch would result from this practice. Now, the extraordinary thing about it is this, that the very chaplain who gave these lectures had in his own upbringing been given the same lecture by other chaplains, and this went back some distance in history, I imagine. And they all knew perfectly well that one of the characteristic behavior patterns of adolescence is ritual defiance of authority. But you have to make some protest against authority, and in this you are in league with all your contemporaries, your peer group. And nobody, of course, would dream of giving anybody else away, because that would be to be a tattletale, a skunk, definitely not one of the boys. And so, therefore, quite obviously, masturbation provided the ideal outlet for this ritual defiance, because it was fun, it was also an assertion of masculinity, and it was very, very wicked. So I meditated on this some time as to why the system continued. And I came to the realization that the Christian put-down of sex is an extremely mysterious thing. In the religious background of the Western world, we have in the main two traditions, one Semitic and one Greek. So far as the Semitic tradition is concerned, the material world and sexuality are definitely good things. Both Jews and Muslims think that God's creation of beautiful women was a grand idea. In the Arabic book, which is their Islamic version of the Kama Sutra, known as the Perfumed Garden, the book opens with a prayer to Allah, which is thanksgiving, a very full, detailed thanksgiving for the loveliness of women with which Allah has blessed mankind. Proverbs, we are enjoined to enjoy our wives while they are young. But on the whole, it is the Semitic belief that sexuality is justified solely for purposes of reproduction of the species. This makes it good in the eyes of God, and sexual energy should not really be wasted for other purposes. That's the limitation put on it. Now, on the other hand, we have a Greek tradition, which is peculiar in that it is strongly influenced by a dualistic view of the universe, in which material existence is conceived as a trap, as a fall into turgid, clogging matter, which is antagonistic to the lightness and freedom of the spirit. And therefore, for certain kinds of Greek religion, among which we must name the Orphic mysteries, the Neoplatonic point of view, and the later Gnostic points of view, being saved means being delivered from material existence into a purely spiritual state. From this point of view, sexual involvement is the very archetype of material involvement. Mater, mother, matter, matter are really the same word. And so the love of woman is the great snare. This is incidentally a doctrine invented by men. And it goes back to the words of Adam. The woman that thou gavest me, she tempted me, and I did eat. Now, in the development of Christian theology, from approximately the time of St. Paul through the beginning of the Renaissance, it was universally held that sex was a bad thing. You should read St. Augustine on this. He said that in the Garden of Eden before the fall, reproduction took place in just the same way and with just the same lack of excitement as one excretes or passes water, and there was no shameful excitation of the sexual parts. And the whole attitude of the Church Fathers in those centuries was that the virgin state was immensely superior spiritually to the married state, and that sexual relationships were excusable only within the bonds of marriage and for the sole purposes of reproduction. And the manual, the moral penitentiaries of the theologians of the Middle Ages list all sorts of penances that must be said even by married couples who performed sexual intercourse on the night before attending Mass, were still before receiving Holy Communion, and of course it must utterly be avoided on certain great church festivals. So although in theory marriage is a sacrament which somehow blesses this peculiar relationship, there is a definite attitude that it is, after all, dirty and not very nice. Now you must realize, too, that in those days the institution of marriage was not what it is today. Marriage, at the time of the rise and development of Christianity, was a social institution for alliances between families. You did not marry the person of your own choice except under the most peculiar circumstances. You married the girl your family picked out for you, and they thought it over carefully, from its political point of view, as well as from the point of view of eugenics, and whether this was a good, healthy girl, and whether this was a good, healthy man, and they had an economic bargaining about it, and you married this girl. You weren't necessarily in love with her. And it was perfectly well understood in the secular world that on the side you had other arrangements. You had, if you could afford them, concubines, or even second and third and fourth wives. And these subsidiary wives were, there was a somewhat more choice open to you in getting those than in the first one. First one is definitely a family arrangement. Now that's the context of it, don't forget that. So what the church was saying was only that woman should be your bedfellow whose marriage has been arranged by paternal authority. The idea of romantic love does not arise in connection with marriage until the troubadour cults of southern France, of Provence, in the late Middle Ages, when there begins to be this idea of the idealization of a woman as the inspiring goddess, almost, of the knight errant. Dante's Beatrice is the inspiring woman who leads him to heaven. Now, historians are not agreed as to whether the lady loves of the chivalrous knights were in fact their mistresses, or whether they were simply idealized women. But the influence of the cult of romantic love on the West was profound. And it brought about a weird combination of ideas. One, the notion of the married state being the only licit relationship in which sexual play might be carried on. And two, the notion that the girl you marry should be the one you've fallen in love with. Two more ill-adjusted ideas could hardly be put together. Because naturally, when you love someone very much indeed, in the enthusiasm and ardor of youth, you say things that are hardly logical or rational. You stand up before an altar and you say, "My darling, my sweetheart, my perfect pet, I adore you so much that I will live with you forever and ever until death do us part." And that's the way you feel at the time. In a rather similar mood, ancient peoples would hail their kings and say, "O king, live forever." Obviously, this was not literally meant. They were just wishing him a long life. But to live forever, no, sir. No mortal does that. So the trouble was, you see, that when certain kinds of extravagant poetic expressions got in the hands of people like Augustine and Tertullian, who were rather influenced by Roman literalness, they wrote it into the law books. And so this amazing situation came about. But we still have not fully explored the subtlety of it. Let us consider certain periods when this attitude of prudism towards sexuality was in an ascendancy. Nearest to our times is the bourgeois revolution, you might call it, in Victorian England and the United States. We all say Victorian as an adjective to indicate Grundyism, extreme monogamy, a definite disgust for all things sexual. And yet, when we really go into the history of the Victorian period, we find that it was an extremely lascivious epoch. One has only to look at the lushness of Victorian furniture to realize that chairs are disguised women. That the way even piano legs are shaped I mean, this kind of thing is throughout Victorian art forms. And the conduct of the British aristocracy during that period beggared description. People like Freud and Havelock Ellis made a certain mistake. They said about the church and about religion in general that it was nothing but a form of sublimated sex. They said these people, for curious reasons, suppress sex. And therefore it becomes a very powerful force for them. You must remember, of course, that they worked on a hydraulic analogy of human psychology, that they likened it all to a river. If you dammed it up, it would burst the dam. It doesn't actually follow that human psychology is hydraulic. But this is the metaphor they use. Now, they said the church has repressed sex. But actually, if you look at its symbolism, it is nothing but an expression of sex. Everything is reduced to libido as the fundamental reality. And the church replied, nothing of the kind. We deny this. We think that this reduction of everything to sex is just a way of attacking holy things. And on the contrary, we would say that people who are fascinated with sex and make it their god are repressing religion. Now, the problem in this debate, everybody missed the boat. The church should have been in a position to say to Freud, well, of course, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, our symbolism is sexual. The steeples on our churches, the vesicle-shaped windows and so heraldic shields on which we put images of the crucifix or the Virgin Mother of God. These are all quite plainly sexual, but you see, the sexual biology, in its turn, reveals the mysteries of the universe. Sex is not mere sex. Sex is a holy thing, and is one of the most marvelous revelations of the divine. But imagine, the church just couldn't say that. If you look at Tibetan Buddhist iconography, their images, or you look in Hindu temples, you will find things that Europeans and Americans have never been able to understand. Here are images of Buddhas and of the gods engaged in amazing diversions with their female counterparts. And everybody thinks that these are kind of dirty sculptures. Now, they're nothing of the kind. They are saying to the people who look at them, the play of man and woman is on that level, on the level of biology, a reflection of the fundamental play of the cosmos. The play of the positive and negative principles, of the light and the dark, of the mental and the material. They all play together. And the function of sexual play is not merely the survival and utilitarian function of reproducing the species, as it is among animals to a very large extent. What peculiarly distinguishes human sexuality is that it brings the partners closer and closer to each other in an intense state of united feeling. In other words, it is a sacrament, the outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace bringing about love. And so, if that is peculiar to human beings, it is perfect nonsense to degrade human sexuality by saying it should only be carried on in the way that the animals do theirs, because they have not yet, as it were, evolved to the place where sex is the sacramental expression of man and woman's love. And this love, in that sense, is a kind of enthusiasm, which means a being possessed by the divine. falling in love, although considered by practical people to be a sort of madness, is actually the same sort of thing as the mystical vision, a grace. And in its light, we see people in their divine aspect. When, as the song says, every little breeze whispers Louise, there is a sort of extraordinary state of mystical intoxication in which the ideal woman has become the goddess, which is, from one point of view, what every woman is, if you see her with the scales off your eyes. And likewise every man, seen with the scales off her eyes. So, what happened then as a result of this historical situation was mutual name-calling between the proponents of religion and the proponents of scientific naturalism, such as Freud and Havelock Ellis, and in our own times Albert Ellis, and people of that kind. They've never got together because they've never understood, neither the church nor the opponents of the church have clearly understood that the secret or unconscious motivation of sexual repression is to make it all the more interesting. And on the other side, it has not been clearly understood that the sexual biology and all that goes with it is a figuring forth on the level of biology of what the whole universe is about. Ecstatic play. So as a result, there has been a kind of compromise. Today in ecclesiastical circles, sex is being damned with faint praise. People are saying, after all, yes, sex was made by God, and we should remember the Jewish point of view. And it is perhaps for something more than reproduction, to bring about the cementing of the marriage ties between husband and wife. But still in practice, it remains the frightening taboo. On the other hand, the opposition to Christian prudery goes overboard and always moves in the direction of total license. You see, what's going on is a contest between the people who want the skirts pulled down to the floor and the people who want them pulled up to the neck. And you know, you've got to draw the line somewhere. But the play between these forces is, where are we going to draw it? Well, that's very exciting. Provide neither side wins. I mean, imagine what it would be like if the libertines won. And they took over the church, so that on Wednesday evenings, the young Presbyterian group would meet for prayer through sex. Every child would go to the school physician for a course in hygienics, and they would have classes, and they'd have plastic models, and all the children would do it in class, in very clean, hygienic circumstances, all sprayed with rubbing alcohol. Everything would be fine. Imagine how boring it would all become. So you see, the people who say, no, modesty is important, have something right about them. But they mustn't be allowed to get away with it. But they mustn't be obliterated. See, life works that way. Let's take an entirely different analogy. Let's take a given biological group, a species we'll call A. It has a natural enemy, B. Now one day A gets furious at the natural enemy B and says, let's obliterate it. And they gather their forces and they knock out their natural enemy. Well, suddenly after a while they begin to get weak. They get overpopulated. There's nobody around to eat up their surplus creatures, and they don't have to keep their muscles tensed against any enemy, and they begin to fall apart because they destroyed their enemy. What they should do is cultivate the enemy. That's the real meaning of love your enemy. There is such a thing as a beloved enemy. And if you don't have a beloved enemy, in other words, if the flies and the spiders don't go together, there's going to be too many spiders or too many flies. And these balances keep the course of nature going. Well, it's exactly the same thing as between the libertines and the prudes. They need each other. And you should thank, if you've got a prudish father and mother, you should be very grateful to them for having made sex so interesting. So don't defy them completely. Don't go around campus with placards bearing four-letter words, because that's going to spoil the show. But every generation must react to the one before, you see, to keep this tension going. And it is by this tension, this play of the opposites, that we have the love that makes the world go round. This is the great discussion going on in what we call today the new theology, the revolution within standard brand Christianity. Because you see, for years and years, the clergy, the ministry of the various churches, such as Episcopalian, Methodist, Baptist, Congregational, Unitarian, even in some cases disciples of Christ and Lutherans, their theological seminaries have been discussing religion in terms utterly different than we will normally hear. And every graduate of an intelligent theological school has a sense of intense frustration as he has to get out to work in a community or parish church, because he does not believe what he is supposed to preach. And this has in a way been true for a long, long time. Clergy, except in the Roman Catholic Church, where the situation is somewhat different, are very heavily controlled by the laity, because he who pays the piper calls the tune. And therefore they are in a state of constant frustration, because those who contribute most heavily and therefore are most interested in the church tend to be conservative-minded people, and they want that old-time religion. Although, as a matter of fact, what they call the old-time religion is really quite modern. But still, that's what they want. And there are people who, as I would say, would tend to be conservative in their whole attitude to life. Because you see, people of a more liberal disposition couldn't care less about going to church. In the British Army, they have a thing called church parade. And there's a famous story about a drill sergeant who got all the troops up for church parade on a Sunday morning, and he used to call out, "Catholics to the right, Protestants to the left, fancy religions in the middle." And to the degree you see that intelligent people in our culture have any religion at all, it tends to be a fancy religion. Something in the new kinds of things that may be unity, Christian Science, Theosophy, Buddhism, Vedanta, or some kind of special Protestant offshoot, such as the Fellowship Church in San Francisco, or the Community Church in New York, and things of theologically. So the new theology comes at this time to a very large extent because A, the clergy are fed up, B, Christianity has its back to the wall, and the Pope knows this better than anybody. And so hand in hand with this ecumenical move, there goes along a reconsideration of what on earth it's all about. Is there a God? Is there God? And a lot of people are boldly saying that is to be abandoned. As an English priest, Father Maskell, put it, it is the basic assumption of the secularist movement in Christian theology that life is a journey between the maternity ward and the crematorium, and that is what there is. That's it. And that only is the life that the Christian religion has to do with, to encounter. And therefore, more than ever, being a Christian, if it is an abandonment of God, or of the idea that the universe is supernaturally controlled, the Christian religion fastens itself therefore with peculiar and increased fervor to the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. As one wit put it, there is no God and Jesus Christ is his only Son. Because you see, what otherwise makes you a Christian? There's something strange about Christianity, in that it shares with Islam and Judaism what we might call theological imperialism. Christians are of even the most liberal stripe, fervently believe that their religion is the best religion. And they will state it by saying, either Jesus Christ is the only Son of God. That's an orthodox way. As a matter of fact, it isn't really an orthodox way of saying it. That's the way orthodox people do say it. Or they will say, Jesus is the greatest man that ever lived. The point is that you make a commitment to the following of Jesus as an historical personage. And for some reason or other, people who commit themselves to this exclusive kind of following of Jesus become exceedingly obstreperous, because they will either damn other religions outright or far more insidiously damn them with faint praise. Old Buddha taught some very good things, you know, and we all are indebted to his great moral principles, but then comes this pitch, you see, for the soul following of Jesus as the Lord and Master, head and shoulders above all. Well, the trouble with that has always been that when you get into a theological argument with a person who is a Christian, you get into a situation where the advocate and the judge are the same person. That is to say, Jesus is judged the best man in the world by the standards of Christianity, because those are the standards with which this kind of person judges. And therefore, and you'll find that people who leap to these judgments usually don't know very much about any other kind of religion. The courses on comparative religion in theological schools are shockingly superficial and grossly inaccurate. And so this is coming to the front now, you see. In order to be to belong to the church, really, is to be saved. And to be saved is to belong to the innest in-group. You have to have an in-group, you see. If you want to know who you are, you have to belong to something. Say, if you want to distinguish yourself, because you know who you are because of the people who aren't like you. There you get a contrast. Now, this is the basic arrangement for a church. So, you see, if you want to be in some kind of an in-group, you must put everybody else beyond the pale. St. Thomas Aquinas gave the show away. actually, because he said that the blessed in heaven will often walk to the battlements and look down and delight in the justice of God being properly carried out in hell. So, but you may not believe in hell, you may be very liberal, and after all, it's not nice or sophisticated nowadays to believe in everlasting damnation. But we have new words for it, such as failing to be a real person, sinking below the human level, or entering into final and irremediable psychosis. All these are new words, either for damnation or heresy. And so you join, and you know you're saved only if somebody else isn't, if somebody else is damned. It's very difficult to believe, or even to imagine a state of affairs where everyone and everything is saved. You have to be a mystic even to think about that, because it requires having a state of consciousness which transcends oppositions, and you can't do that along the line of ordinary logic. You have to have a new kind of logic which takes over at a certain point. And this logic I'm using at the moment by pointing out that damned people and saved people need each other. They are in a symbiotic relationship with each other. They go together in the same way as the back and the front of something, because if something has a front, it has to have a back too. And so, the very fact that fronts and backs go together indicates that there is a unity between these two opposed sides. So also there is a unity between the damned and the saved. And it's only as you begin to realize that you need the damned people in order to be saved, and that the damned people need the saved people in order to be damned, that you start laughing about it. And that laughter is very subversive. And it's, you know how it is, you're not supposed to laugh in church, and not in courts of law either. There are places where laughter makes people nervous, because it's supposed to be a sign of disrespect. Now, it may not be so at all. Dante said that the song of the angels in paradise sounded like the laughter of the universe. But in church, especially any rather more serious kinds of church, laughing is very bad form. Why? Because if you look at the design of a Catholic church, you will notice that it is based upon the design of the courtroom of a king. And if you look at a Protestant church, you will see that it is based upon the design of a law court. Indeed, the Protestant minister wears exactly the same robes as an American judge. And all those pews and box-like stalls are the same you will find in the old-fashioned court, with the witness box, jury box, and all that kind of thing. But you see, the original idea of the Christian church, these ancient Roman churches, are called a basilica. That means the courtroom of a king, the throne room. The altar is the throne of God. Now, in a courtroom, the king is very nervous, because anybody who takes it upon himself to govern other people and rule them had better watch out. And therefore, he always has his back to the wall. And he is flanked by attending guards and high ministers of state. And just so that nobody will get up and make trouble, he has them either on their knees or flat on their faces when they come into his presence. And of course, no one must laugh. Mr. Big. And so this was the pattern, this was the model upon which the Judeo-Christian idea of God was based. It is a political model, and the title of God is taken from the supreme emperors of Persia, the Dayan Khan, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And so in the English church, at morning prayer, the clergyman gets up and says, Almighty and everlasting God, the only ruler of princes, King of kings, Lord of lords, who dost from thy throne behold all dwellers upon earth, most graciously deign to behold our gracious sovereign lady, Queen Elizabeth, and all the royal family. That's the picture. And the metaphor, you may not believe, literally, that God sits on a throne, or even has a body to put on, or that he wears a crown, or that he has a beard. But the image colors your feeling about the character. And imagery is much more powerful than intellectual nonsense. You may know, it says in the prayer book, that God is a spirit without body, parts, or passions, omnipresent to all places, eternal through all time. And therefore one thinks, as Haeckel does, of the gaseous vertebrate. Or else of an enormously diffused sea of luminous jello, filling all time and space. Everybody uses images. But behind those images are the old images that influenced us in childhood. And if you still attend a church and you use that imagery, you still think emotionally. You feel towards God as one would if you took it literally. So this political model of God has dominated the West. And the world is related to God as subjects to a king or as artifacts to a maker. We have, of course, a ceramic model of the universe, because it's said in the book of Genesis that God made Adam out of the dust of the ground. In other words, he made a clay figurine and then blew the breath of life into the nostrils of the figurine so that it came to life. Now, the Hindus don't have that model of the universe to cope with, because they don't look at the universe as God's creation in the sense of being an artifact. They look at it as God's drama, because they see the world as acted, not created. God is that which is pretending to be all this. And everybody is really God, is a mask of God, who is playing that he's you. But he's doing it so well that he's taken himself in, because he's the audience as well as the actor. It's a really successful play, because the good actor, although you know a play is just a play, a good actor is going to try and make you think it isn't. He wants to get you crying. He wants to get you sitting on the edge of your seat in anticipation. And God, as the best actor, has convinced himself completely that the act is real. The Chinese again have a different model. Their model of the universe is an organic one. It is a great organism. It is alive. It grows. It is an intelligent order. So those are the three great models of the world. When the West stopped believing seriously in God a long time ago, they, however, retained the idea of the world as an artifact. And so we graduated from the ceramic model of the universe to the fully automatic model, which is actual common sense for most people living today. I return to the point then that the clergy and the church people don't really believe in God in the old-fashioned sense of the word God at all. If they did believe the Christian religion in some of its orthodox forms seriously, they would be screaming in the streets. And even the most far-out lunatic fringe, Jehovah's Witnesses, are even more or less polite when they come and call at your house. Because if they really believed that you were going to hell, they would make more fuss about you than if you had the bubonic plague. But nobody really takes it that seriously any longer. And that means they don't believe in it. They know they ought to believe in it. In fact, many sermons are exhortations to have more faith. which means that we all recognize that we don't really believe in this, and we ought to. We feel very guilty about it. We don't have the moral strength to believe in this. But it isn't only a matter of moral strength. It's a matter of being asked to believe what most people feel is nonsense, that the world is run on the lines of a state. How, for example, can you be a citizen of the United States, having taken an oath that a republican form of government is the best form of government, and believe that the universe is a monarchy? So what has happened is, intelligent people have always realized that this political model for the cosmos won't do. Now, actually, no serious theologian ever did believe that God was an old gentleman with whiskers on a golden throne. Never. What the Bishop of Woolwich says in his book, Honest to God, that there isn't some sort of someone out there, he is very naive in a way, because he could have taken huge quotations out of St. Thomas Aquinas, out of the great fathers of the church, from Origen, from Clement of Alexandria, from St. Gregory Nazianzus, from St. John of Damascus, from St. Basil the Great, from St. Augustine, from St. Ambrose, from Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Albert the Great. He could have quoted all those perfectly orthodox, very correct theologians, and shown that they never believed in a God like that with whiskers. And he could have come forward and said, you see, this is a perfectly orthodox book. And I'm not a revolutionary, I'm just going back to the real old-time religion. He didn't do that. And do you know why? He told me. He never read those writers in theological school. He was entirely confined to biblical studies and never got as far as that, you see? So, but it's just the same with ever so many people. One of the reasons why so many people turned to an Oriental religion was that the level, the intellectual level at which Oriental religions were first presented in the West was so much higher than the intellectual level at which Christianity was presented at the local church. If you lived in India or Ceylon, of course, there would be the local Buddhist monastery, and it would be just as junky as the stuff was around the local church. They don't tell people all about the Great Void and how to practice meditation and those things. That's for specialists, the minority. All they care about is gaining merit, mostly by making contributions to the clergy, or better circumstances in your next life, or getting out of evil karma. That's the real thing popular is about. But you see, the trouble in the West is that everybody's getting educated. There's a terrific literacy. And therefore, the public has to be treated as if it were intelligent. You can't say the public be damned anymore. There's too many intelligent people. Now, let's look at the lineup. What sort of a situation is this, really? For my part, I would say the God that is dead is this political model God. However conceived, the divine paternalistic authority who rules the universe, and to whom you as an ego are related as a subject to a king, by analogy. See? Now that one just isn't holding up. But what's the alternative? Especially think about what could be an alternative for Western people with a Christian background. What other kind of God could we have? Well, one possibility is none. And this is what people like Altizer are discussing. He's on the far left of this new theology. I would say a man like James Pike is on the right of the new theology. He very definitely believes in God. He's a theist. But he doesn't believe in anything with whiskers on it. Nor does he really believe in the political model. Are we going to settle then for the fact that the universe is just what it appears to be? Or are we going to have a very refined conception of God, which will be called it instead of he? That makes a lot of difference. Very powerful what pronoun you use. Or even he, she. The Christian scientists talk about the father, mother. It's sort of complicated. People feel that's a little bit weird. It is rather simple, but then when you say it, does it mean that God is something like electricity? Which doesn't seem to have any independent intelligence of its own. You can use it intelligently, but it's just energy. It does something goes zoom, see? Is that God? Is God it like that? Or what? Well, it's a funny thing, but it's very difficult to be a complete atheist. Real atheist. Like in the House of Parliament in England, when in 1928 the Church of England wanted a new prayer book, a revised prayer book, because the Church and the State are inseparable in England. The Houses of Parliament had to vote on whether this prayer book might be used. And somebody got up and said, this is perfectly ridiculous. An assemblage which contains a number of atheists voting on the inner politics of the Church of England. And another member got up and he said, oh, I don't think there are any atheists here, not really. We all believe in some sort of a something somewhere. Now you see, in the theological world, it just doesn't do to believe in some sort of a something somewhere. Because one thing that theologians detest is vagueness. You should listen to them. Either no God at all, because that's clear and precise. No beating around the bush, old man. You know, it's just fuzzy thinking to have the great universal mind, the undifferentiated aesthetic continuum. That's all some sort of a something somewhere. Woolly thinking. Either no God, or a God with a definite character and a clear moral will and precise standards who will not be pushed around. Wowee. What do? Do you put your mind into two watertight compartments, one of which you're abreast of science and the modern world and all that kind of thing, and the other compartment, which simply has nothing to do with that, is a completely cut off thing called religion, where you believe in absolutely ludicrous propositions. A lot of people do that. But a lot of people want a religion which is difficult to believe in, because that's a kind of a test of faith, whether you can swallow it. What do? Do you put your mind into two watertight compartments, one of which you're abreast of science and the modern world and all that kind of thing, and the other compartment, which simply has nothing to do with that, is a completely cut off thing called religion, where you believe in absolutely ludicrous propositions. A lot of people do that. But a lot of people want a religion which is difficult to believe in, because that's a kind of a test of faith, whether you can swallow it. It's like the story about Abraham being told to sacrifice his son Isaac, and he was about to do it because you do what you're told. It's a test of faith. Well, people like the security of a definite religion, something you've got to believe in, and this is the truth. I was once having an argument with a Jehovah's Witness, and he said, don't you think that if there were really a loving God who was concerned about the human race, that he would provide us with an infallible textbook that would tell us how to live? I said he would do nothing of the kind. It would completely destroy the human mind. You know, you'd never have to think if that was the case. So, while there is that, here is then this possibility. See, is it to be no God? Is life just this trip from the maternity ward to the crematorium? And that the issue of religion is to improve that trip. That is to say, through social concern, through getting rid of poverty and war and exploitation and disease. Is that the whole business of religion, or is there something else? Those who take this view, which we will call the secularist position in theology, are of course strongly influenced by contemporary philosophy, especially in that form which is called scientific empiricism or logical positivism, which maintains that the idea of God is not a fallacy, but is a meaningless idea. That, in other words, the proposition that there exists God, and that God is the origin and creator and governor of everything that is happening, they maintain that those sentences are utterly devoid of meaning. As much so as if I were to say everything is up. Because they will say no logical proposition can be made about all processes whatsoever, because all propositions are labels on boxes, and you can't have the box containing all boxes, because this box would have no outside, and therefore it wouldn't be a box. So all propositions, all words, must refer to classes of some kind, and you can't have the class of all classes. And also, they would say, the notion that there is a God is meaningless because it doesn't help you to make any prediction. Or they can ask it in this way: what evidence, supposing somebody could bring it forward, would completely satisfy you as disproving the existence of God? And no believer in God can think of any evidence that would conclusively prove that there wasn't a God. Just like psychoanalysts are completely incapable of thinking of any evidence which would disprove the existence of the Oedipus complex. So they, on logical grounds, take this position. And so, since many theologians are in fact influenced by modern philosophy, take these arguments seriously, they would like to secularize the whole conception of religion, or, to put it in Bonhoeffer's words, have Christianity without religion. Well, now, when you might say there is nothing to life except the trip between eternity water and crematorium, that's what there is. I've heard something like that before. When asked what is the Buddha, the Chinese master replied, "It's windy again this morning." Another Buddhist master, on his deathbed, wrote the poem, "From the bathtub to the bathtub, I have uttered stuff and nonsense." The bathtub in which the baby is washed at birth, and the bathtub in which the corpse is washed before burial. All the time between, he said, I was going yakety yak. Now, what about those poems? Do they mean what they say? Well, not quite. There's something different here. Because they are based on a life devoted to the discipline of a very particular kind of meditation, culminating in a completely shattering experience, which is very difficult to talk about. But generally speaking, it is the encounter with eternity, with the eternal. Not necessarily in the sense of that which goes on and on through time, but the eternal is the timeless, that which transcends time, is beyond measurement in terms of hours and days. And when a person who is in that state of consciousness or has been through it looks at the ordinary everyday world, it's true he sees the ordinary everyday world as we see it, but with a very, very extraordinary difference. And if we would have to put that difference into some sort of Western Christian influence language, he would perhaps say, don't you realize that sitting around here in this room, with our ordinary everyday faces and clothes and personalities, we are sitting smack in the middle of the beatific vision. And that this, sitting here in this room, is infinity and eternity precisely. It is it. And this is the beatific vision. This is God. And it feels that way too. It really does. Or something like it. But in this kind of religion, they still have temples, they have Buddhas, and they chant sutras and offer incense and ring gongs and all that kind of thing. But they're always saying that the highest religion, to get there, you have to kill the Buddha. Supposing a clergyman got up one day in the pulpit and said, every time you say Jesus Christ, you have to wash your mouth out. Or if you meet God the Father, kill him. If you meet God the Son, kill him. If you meet God the Holy Spirit, kill him. If you meet the Pope, kill him. If you meet St. Augustine, kill him. If you meet your father and mother, kill them. Kill them all right away. All right, but what I've been saying is simply translating into Christian terms a Buddhist teacher talking about the year 800 AD. That's what he said. Only he put the Buddhist names in where I put the Christian ones in. But I don't think this is what is happening in the movement of the new theology. I think that what's happening there is that they are just getting rid of God. This is not this other thing I'm talking about, which could be called the religion of no religion. You see, if you could take this right into Christianity, because to the extent that every Christian is a Jew, you see, we use the Jewish scriptures as the Old Testament, so every Christian is a Jew. You who are supposed to believe in the Ten Commandments, and one of them says, thou shalt not make to thyself any graven image of anything that is in the heavens above, or the earth beneath, or the waters that are under the earth. Thou shalt not bow to them nor worship them. And that is what this thing I've been talking about is. It is a destruction of idols. Because the most dangerous graven images are not those which are made of wood and stone. They are those which are made of ideas. And it is well known to the great mystical tradition of the world, all over the world, that the sort of supreme vision can only come when you have got rid of every idea of God whatsoever. It would be like, as I've often used this image, cleaning a window on which somebody has painted blue sky. Well, to see the sky, you've got to scrape off the paint. Well, you say, my goodness, you shouldn't take that nice blue painting off. It's very good. It was done by a great artist. See how pretty the clouds are. You mustn't do that because we won't have that blue sky anymore. See? So in that spirit, the great mystics have always ceased to cling to God. That is because the only God you can cling to is the idea of God. In order to discover God, you have entirely to stop clinging. You see, why does one cling to God? For safety, of course. You want to save something. You want to save yourself. I don't care what you mean by saved. Whether it just means feel happy, or feel that life is meaningful, or, the there's somebody up there who cares. So one clings. And if you don't cling to God, you cling to something else. The state, money, sex, yourself, power. These are all false gods. But there has to come a state when clinging stops. And only then does the state of faith begin. People who believe in God don't have any faith because they want something to hold on to. So, real faith is when you do not hold on to anything anymore. In the Christian tradition, this is called the cloud of unknown. There is a book about it, written by a 14th century British monk, anonymous. And he got it from Dionysius the Areopagite, who assumed the name of St. Paul's Athenian convert. He was a Syrian monk living in the 6th century. Both Meister Eckhart, St. Thomas Aquinas, John Scotus Erigena, and many other great medieval theologians studied Dionysius the Areopagite. He wrote a book called the Theologia Mystica, in which he explains that in order to come to full union with God, you must give up every conception of God whatsoever. And he enumerates them. Don't think that God is oneness or threeness or unity or spirit or any kind of anything that the human mind can conceive. He is beyond all that. In this is called apophatic theology. This is a Greek term contrasted with cataphatic. When you speak cataphatically, you say what God is like. So this man, Dionysius, wrote 2 books. One was called The Divine Names, and that was cataphatic theology. The other was called The Mystical Theology, which is apophatic. Cataphatic, what God is like according to analogy. He is like a father. We do not say God is a cosmic male parent, but God is in some respects like a father, like spirit. Like we say nowadays, like man, it's like it's raining. You know, there's a certain relativity to that statement. So this is the cataphatic language. The apophatic says what God is not. And all those theologians in the following of Dionysius said the highest way of talking about God is in negative terms. Just as, to use Dionysius' own image, when a sculptor makes a figure, he does it entirely by removing stuff, taking something away. So in the same way, St. Thomas Aquinas said, because God, by his infinity, exceeds every idea to which the human mind can reach, the best way to speak of him is by remotion. That is to say, by removing from our view of God every inadequate concept. This is what the Hindus call neti, neti, saying of the Brahman, of the supreme reality, it is not this, it is not this. But this intellectual operation of destroying concepts must go hand in hand with a, shall we call it, psychological operation, which is ceasing to cling to any image whatsoever, or simply ceasing to cling. Now why? Well, because there's no need to. There's no need to cling. Because when you were born, you were kicked off a precipice. And it was a big explosion. A lot of other things are falling down with you, including some pretty large lumps of rock. One of them's called the Earth. And it won't help you to cling to the rocks when you're falling off the precipice. It may give you an illusion of safety. But everything is falling. It's falling apart. That's what the ancients said, when all is transient. Pantarei, all flows, in the words of Heraclitus. And you can't cling to anything. It's like grabbing at smoke with a non-existent hand. That's all the clinging will ever achieve. All it does is make people anxious. So when you come to the realization that you cannot cling to anything, that there is nothing to cling to, there transpires an inner change of consciousness, which we can call either faith or letting go. And then suddenly the thing hits you. In Sanskrit, they put it this way: Tattvamasi means literally, that art thou, or as we would say, you're it. And if you are God, then you can't have an idea of God any more than you can chew your own teeth. You don't need one. The sun doesn't need to shine on itself. Knives don't need to cut themselves. Your eyes don't need to look at themselves. What color is your head to your eyes? It isn't black, is it? You can't see anything. Matter of fact, the way it feels inside your head is what you call what it looks like outside. All these things you see outside are states of the nervous system in the brain. That's how it feels. That's how it looks inside the head. And you said, well, I thought that was what was outside. True. Same way. When the Zen master suddenly discovered that carrying the pail with water in it was a miracle, he discovered that. He realized there isn't anything except God. And boy, you don't, if you really know that, you see, you don't need to have a religion. But you can have one because it's a free world. I mean, if you want to try and express this in some way, and all religion is pure gravy after that. See? Any outward manifestation of religion. You know, it's like a man with lots of money making some more. Only it's quite unnecessary. But so, according to the very best theologians, it was never necessary for God to create the world. It didn't add anything to him. He didn't have to do it. He was under no compulsion. So he did it out of what Dionysius the Areopagite calls hyperpleres, or we would anglicize it, hyperpleres, superfullness. In other words, for kicks. I mean, you know, we don't like using that language, but it's completely contemporary. It's exactly right. That's what the Bible says. Only it puts it in a more sedate way. It says, His Majesty did it for his daughter. Well, that's the way you talk about somebody who's the king. We are not men. And it says in the book of Proverbs, and divine wisdom and speaks as God standing beside him. everything goes up. Because here we are. It's what we were looking for all the time. It's right here. And that's it, that's the thing. And you realize that you basically, through and through, are all this. Only you got into a kind of a funny illusion. I think that we get into that illusion in rather a complicated way through our upbringing as children. Because many little children know from the beginning. They haven't got words for it. See, that's the whole problem with child psychology. What child psychologist is ideally looking for is an articulate baby. They can explain what it's like to be a baby. You never get there. But by the time by teaching the child to speak, you mess it up. You give it this language, and you can't think big thoughts like that with this funny, limited language, especially with the words they start children out with. And then finally, when they've got the poor thing completely hypnotized, they tell it the most preposterous things. They tell it that it must be free. They say to you child, are an independent agent, and you're responsible, see? Now, therefore, we command you to love us. And in other words, we require that you do something which will please us only if you do it voluntarily. Now, do you wonder people are mixed up? So, but I'm afraid, you see, that the new theology isn't onto this. The new theology really is serious about there not being any God, and that the universe is therefore a rather pitiful predicament in which we're caught, has some compensations. That what all this is a continuation of the 19th century philosophy, the fully automatic model, which is that this is an essentially stupid universe. It's a mechanism. It is a gyration of blind energy in which human intelligence and values happens to be a fluke, and a rather uncomfortable one, because nature doesn't give a damn about us. And so we have to fight it. Now, all that is pure mythology. It is grossly unscientific. But most people believe it. It's common sense for today. But what an opportunity, though, there is in the new theology, and in this whole ferment going on, to get them to see this other point of view, and realize that when you get rid of God, all you are doing is you're destroying an idol. And all idols must be destroyed respectfully. Not like those wretched Puritans who went around destroying all the saints' figures and the stained glass in the medieval churches. That was disrespectful iconoclasm. Respectful iconoclasm would be, for example, every Easter Sunday the Bible should be ceremoniously burned. Because if Jesus is truly risen from the dead, you don't need the Bible. He's around. Available. You don't need the books. But burn it up ceremoniously with great respect. Because certainly God doesn't take himself seriously. If he did, I'd shudder to think what would happen.
I want to start by giving what may be to many of you a new definition of the word myth. As normally used, the word myth means an idle tale, a fable, a falsehood, or an idea that's out of date, something untrue. But there is another, older and stricter use of the word myth, whereby it doesn't mean something untrue, but it means an image in terms of which people make sense of life and of the world. Supposing, for example, you don't understand the technicalities of electricity, and somebody wants to explain them to you, He wants to explain about the flow of currents. Well, to do that, he compares electricity with water. And because you understand water, you get some idea about the behavior of electricity. Or if an astronomer wants to explain to you what he means by expanding space, he'll use the metaphor of a balloon, a black balloon with white spots on it. The white spots represent the galaxies. And then if you blow up the balloon, they all get further away from each other at the same speed as the balloon blows up. In neither case are we saying that electricity is water or that the universe is a balloon with white spots on it. We are saying it's something like it. And so in the same way, the human being has always used images to represent his deepest ideas of how the universe works and what man's place in it is. And tonight I'm going to discuss certain aspects of two of the greatest myths in this sense of the word which have influenced mankind's thinking. First of all, the myth of the universe as an artifact, as something made, as a carpenter makes tables, chairs, and houses, or as a potter makes pots, or as a sculptor makes figurines. And on the other hand, the image of the world as a drama, in which all the things in the world are not made but acted in the same way as a player acts parts. For these are the two great images which govern respectively the religions of the West, descending from Hebraism, that is to say, Hebraism itself, Christianity, and Islam, and on the other hand, the myth which governs those religions which have had their origin in India.